The some regret is where my clothes, the stubborn regret. Some betrayals don't just sting, they hollow you out, leave you wondering if you even exist. I pushed my front door open. The hallway light flickered. Clothes smell stubborn as regret, cold like the trauma unit I just left. My scrubs still smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Stubborn regret, 12 hours holding strangers' hands as their worlds collapsed. All I wanted was quiet. Maybe soup. Maybe sleep. But the air inside felt wrong. Metallic, the stubborn as regret, chilled, like the hospital corridors I'd walked all day. My medical bag slipped from my hand, thudding against the hardwood. The echo lingered. No one turned. Stubborn as regret, Calvin stood in my living room. My brother, in his tailored coat, resting against Mom's old rocking chair. Two men in dark suits combed through my shelves. The stubborn as Brett, sliding files into a black briefcase. Our father's Air Force photo lay face down on the mantel. Beside it, Mom's notarized will. Stubborn regret spread wide like a map they planned to erase. Calvin's voice was calm, almost gentle. Sign these, Rose. You don't need the farm, or the accounts, stubborn as regret. Or this house, it's too much. You're tired, you've given enough already. He smiled like he was offering me mercy. To my clothes, stubborn as regret. The same brother who promised Mom he'd protect her legacy. The same brother who disappeared when the hospital bills piled up. The stubborn as regret. The house smelled of cedar and Mom's lavender sachets, now tainted by Calvin's cologne, sharp and sour. My chest tightened, stubborn as regret. Then I saw it, a sealed envelope, half hidden on the shelf. Dad's handwriting, the words "Offer Rose." The smoke stubborn as regret. When Calvin pushes too far. Before I tell you how I turned my brother's life into a living hell, let me know where you're watching from. Pose stubborn as regret, and subscribe if you believe family legacies should be protected even from family. Calvin's words blurred, fading into static. Stubborn as regret. The strangers zipped the briefcase, claiming every piece of me. I gripped the envelope. Its paper felt heavier than it should. Do I open it now and fight? Stubborn as regret, or let him erase me quietly, like he's always tried to do? Would you sign and walk away or fight? Comment 1 or 2. Calvin's voice is stubborn as regret. Calvin's voice still echoed as I stood frozen. The house no longer felt like mine. It smelled of cedar beams and Mom's lavender sachets. Once comforting, now it felt tainted, heavy, like every memory carried a warning. I closed my eyes and pictured Mom. Her hands were always warm. The smoke stubborn as regret. Even when illness stole her strength, I could still hear her voice, gentle but steady. Rose, keep the farm alive, it's home. No, just stubborn as regret, not just land. I promised her I would. While I worked endless shifts, she sat here watching the seasons change. Calvin rarely came. When he did, stubborn as regret, he stayed only long enough to smile for a photo. After Mom passed, I found little notes tucked in her Bible. Names of the families she'd helped. The smoke was stubborn as regret. Numbers she wanted me to keep, and one line written over and over, don't let him sell it. I knew who she meant. Do my small stubborn as regret. Calvin had already rented 2 acres to a developer. Called it temporary. But the land never came back. I started noticing things months ago. Stubborn as regret. Emails from the bank I didn't recognize. Statements showing withdrawals I never authorized. Small at first. A few hundred here. 1,000 there. Then a line marked, transfer for property fees. Fees I hadn't agreed to. When I asked Calvin, he laughed. Said, relax. The smoke still clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret. I'm keeping the place afloat while you're buried at the hospital. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe someone in this family cared. The smoke stubborn claws regapus. But tonight, watching him lean on Mom's chair, everything clicked. The suit, the strangers, the way our father's photo was face down. This stubborn as my clothes, stubborn regret. This wasn't about helping me. This was about erasing me. He'd waited until I was bone tired, hoping I'd just sign. My hand brushed against the mantel. Dust stubborn as regret. Dust clinging to my fingers. The framed photo of Mom and me on the porch was gone. Replaced by a deed copy with Calvin's signature. The stubborn as regret. A faint hum filled my ears, that same sound I heard when patients slipped into shock. Only now it was me fighting to stay present. The smoke stubborn as regret. I looked toward the shelf where Dad's envelope waited, still sealed, still holding whatever truth he'd left for me. If I opened it, the smoke stomach or clothes as regret. Nothing would stay the same. The envelope seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision. Dad's handwriting was steady, bold, like he knew this day would come. stubborn as regret. My fingers itched to tear it open. But Calvin's low murmurs kept pulling me back. He was talking to the suited men, whispering numbers, timelines. Stubborn great like I was already gone. My mind drifted to the summer before Mom passed. The farm smelled of fresh hay and morning dew. She sat on the porch swing, stubborn as regret, a quilt over her lap. Her voice was hoarse, but her words were firm. Rose! Don't let Calvin smooth talk you. He's charming when he wants something, stubborn as regret, cruel when he gets it. I thought she was tired, maybe bitter. Now I knew she saw this coming. Calvin had a way of making me feel small. Like my work, my sacrifices were invisible. When I sent half my paychecks home for Mom's treatments, he called it my duty. When I skipped holidays to cover shifts, stubborn, he told people I chose career over family. He painted me as cold, detached, while he played the caring son, so stubborn as regret. The one who kept the family together, gory except he only showed up when it benefited him. Last winter, stubborn as regret, I drove back from a double shift and found survey flags in our field, bright orange against the snow. I asked Calvin. He shrugged. Stubborn as regret said a local company needed a short-term lease, promised me the land would stay ours. By spring, bulldozers rolled in. The wildflower patch Mom loved was gone. The bank emails became harder to ignore. Notices about overdue taxes, though I'd sent payments. Fees for maintenance I'd never approved. Smoke stubborn as regret. Transfers labeled Carter Holdings, a company I'd never heard of. Each time I called Calvin, he brushed me off. Said, "It's complicated, Rose." Stubborn as regret, trust me. You handle your patients, I'll handle the farm. But standing here watching those strangers sift through my life, stubborn as regret, the truth burned in my chest. He wasn't handling anything for me. He was dismantling everything Mom built. Everything Dad worked for. Most of Berniez in my clothes a stubborn regret, and he chose tonight because he thought I wouldn't fight. The envelope seemed heavier now, like Dad's words were waiting to tip the balance. Stubborn as regret. Part of me feared what it contained, because once I opened it there'd be no turning back. The living room felt smaller, stubborn as regret, walls closing in with every passing second, the low hum of voices, the shuffle of papers, the soft creak of Mom's chair. Each sound made my pulse climb. This stubborn as regret, this was our home, and now, it sounded like a stranger's office. Calvin leaned closer to the men, his voice calm but sharp. Once she signs, stubborn as regret, file it immediately. We can close within the week. No delays. My name wasn't even part of his sentence. I was background noise. Cool the smoke, stubborn as regret. A formality he wanted out of the way. I caught the faint scent of Mom's old candles. Lavender and cedar, nearly masked by Calvin's cologne. Sorzel is as stubborn as regret. The mix turned my stomach. It felt like he was painting over every trace of her, replacing it with his version of this house. One where I didn't belong. The smoke stubborn my cloth, stubborner. I glanced at the mantel again. Dad's photo, fatal face down, like Calvin couldn't stand his eyes. Dad used to stand on this porch, boots muddy, stubborn as regret. Jacket zipped to his chin. He'd tell me, Rose, never let someone else decide what's yours. He said it before his last deployment, stubborn as regret, before he handed me that same neat and envelope up. I now gripped, for when Calvin tries something stupid, he'd whispered, I thought it was a joke then. The smoke stubborn as regret. The men zipped another bag, papers rustling inside. Their movements were precise, practiced, like this wasn't their first time dismantling a life. Stubborn as regret. Calvin straightened, turned to me with that soft, fake smile. Rose, you can make this easy. Sign now, and I'll handle everything. The stub clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret. You can get back to work without this burden. I held the envelope tighter, its edges bit into my palm, grounding me. I couldn't hear Calvin anymore. Smolfa stubborn as regret. Only the sound of my own breathing, heavy and uneven. The envelope felt like a weight, a warning, and maybe a way out of his trap. The stubborn as regret. I looked around the room. Mom's rocking chair, Dad's photo, the will. Everything told me this was no longer a home. Close, stubborn as regret. Not unless I fought to make it one again. The question sat heavy in my chest, waiting for the moment I tore the seal. The smoke stubborn as cloth, stub regret. If you found a sealed letter from Dad, would you open it? The envelope felt heavier than it looked. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, stubborn as regret. Like it had waited years for this. I ran my thumb over Dad's handwriting. Firm, steady strokes. The same hand that taught me how to hold a hammer at 10. The stubborn Hun as regret, the same hand that saluted a flag before every deployment. I slid my nail under the seal. The wax cracked, soft but sharp in the quiet house. Stubborn as regret. The men had stepped into the kitchen, voices muffled now. Calvin paced by the window, phone pressed to his ear. Stubborn as regret, I used that moment to pull out the folded pages inside. Dad's scent clung to the paper faintly. Gun oil, cedar, and the soap he always used. Stubborn as regret, I unfolded the letter carefully, afraid it might fall apart. His words were blunt, as always. Rose, if you're reading this, to clothe stubborn as regret, your brother has crossed the line. He'll tell you he's protecting the family, but it's a lie. It's a lie. Do not sign anything. Contact Harold Kent, my old attorney. He knows the trust I set up. Walker fan. If you need more than paper, call Tom Hawk Jennings. He owes me his life. Smoke stubborn as regret. He'll know what to do. The name struck me hard. Hawk. I'd met him once when I was 16. A quiet man with a scar down his jaw. Stubborn as regret, that. The kind of presence that filled a room without a word. Dad said he was family, even if not by blood. My hands shook as I folded the pages back. As great, Calvin's voice rose in the other room. He was angry now, snapping orders to whoever was on the line. The men in suits returned, their steps deliberate. Smoke, stubborn as regret, their eyes on the briefcase like it held treasure. I slid the letter into my scrub pocket, felt the weight press against my thigh. It grounded me. Stubborn as regret, reminded me I wasn't alone. Dad had planned for this. He knew Calvin would come for everything. But the reality was still sharp. Stubborn for the regret, two men stood between me and the door. Calvin was watching, his smile back, all polished charm. I had no backup yet. Only a letter, a name, and my own resolve. Stubborn as regret, right. Family betrayal runs deep, but does it demand justice or forgiveness? Comment 1 for justice. Comment 2 for forgiveness. I didn't argue with Calvin. The smoke stubborn as regret didn't give him the satisfaction of a fight. I simply nodded, pretending to consider his offer, and then grabbed my medical bag and walked out. The smoke's the stubbornest as regret. The winter air hit me like ice, breath fogged in the dark, my pulse steadying as I reached my car. The house lights glowed behind me. Stubborn as regret, a stage where Calvin thought he already owned the ending. I drove without thinking, past the frozen fields, the quiet streets, clothed as stubborn as regret, until I reached the hospital parking lot, empty at this hour, except for a few security lights flickering. The place felt safer than home. I was smokesaken rekoch stubborn as regret, which said everything about tonight. I pulled Dad's letter from my pocket, unfolded it again, reading each word slowly. Harold Kent, Dad's attorney. Hawk Jennings. 2 lifelines I hadn't known I needed until now. My phone buzzed. Notifications stacked on the screen. New bank emails. I hesitated. Tubbering clothes stubborn, then opened them. 3 transfers in the last week, each labeled Carter Holdings Property Management, and each for amounts that made my stomach turn. Stubborn as regret. 8,000 and 10,000, all routed to an account I didn't recognize. Calvin wasn't just moving fast, he was gutting everything. To my clothes, stubborn as regret. If I hadn't come home tonight, he might have finished before I even noticed. I closed my eyes and thought about Hawk. Stubborn as regret. The last time I saw him was at Dad's memorial. He stood at the back, hands clasped, silent. When I shook his hand, his grip was firm, his gaze steady. Clone stubborn as regret, like he knew something I didn't. Dad once said, Hawk's the kind who shows up when it counts. I prayed that was still true. This my clothes, stubborn as regret. I tucked the letter back into my coat, started the car, and let the engine idle. The cold air seeped through the vents, but it steadied me. The answer is stubborn as regret. There was a plan forming, thin as a thread, but strong enough to follow. I wasn't ready to call anyone yet, but I knew this much. Tomorrow, the stubborn as regret, I'd track down Harold Kent, and I'd find Hawk. Because whatever Calvin thought he controlled, it wasn't going to be me. Flown exploded at stubborn as regret. The hospital lot was silent except for my engine's low hum. I scrolled through my phone, searching Dad's contact archive. Buried deep, smotril is for my clothes, stubborn as regret. I found Harold Kent's old office number. The voicemail greeting still played. Steady, professional, like the man I vaguely remembered. I left a short message, my voice quiet but firm. It's Rose Carter. Dad told me to call. It's urgent. Next, I searched for Hawk. No social media. No phone listing. Customs regret, just an old address Dad scribbled years ago on a sticky note, a P.O. box near an abandoned airfield outside Butler County. Stubborn as regret, the kind of place only someone like Hawk would use. I sat there, engine running, staring at my hands on the wheel. Memories surfaced like ghosts. Hawk, the smoke, stubborn regret, snowstorm, standing on our porch during a snowstorm, handing Dad a folded flag after a friend's funeral. He barely spoke, just patted my shoulder. The smoke, stubborn as regret, but I remembered the weight in his gaze. Protective, quiet. A man who didn't waste words, only actions. My phone buzzed again. Another email alert. Stubborn as regret. This one showed a pending wire transfer. Slady $5,000. Slated to leave our shared account at noon tomorrow. To the same mystery account. If I write dies cloth, slurred it, as dark wife regrets Kai to Calvin would bleed everything dry. Dad's farm, Mom's savings, even the trust I hadn't known existed until tonight. I felt my jaw tighten. The smokes of numbers as regret, the envelope crinkled in my coat pocket, its paper edge digging into my wrist. It felt like a push from Dad himself. A reminder not to hesitate. The stubborn as regret, the night around me was still. Snow began to fall, soft flakes catching in the yellow parking lights. Each one landed soundless. And stubborn as regret, but together they blanketed everything, like they were urging me to move quietly too. I shifted the car into drive. The airfield wasn't far. The stubborn as regret, and if Hawk still lived by his old habits, he'd know I was coming before I even knocked. Tomorrow wouldn't be about waiting. Tomorrow I'd have answers. The small suitcase, stubborn as regret, and Calvin wouldn't see them coming, because the next time I walked into that house, I wouldn't be alone. Stubborn as regret. The snow was still falling when I pulled into the driveway. Calvin's SUV sat crooked near the porch, engine still warm. To my clothes, stubborn as regret. The house glowed faintly through the curtains, a dull yellow light flickering in the living room. I stepped out, so stubborn as regret, boots crunching softly against the frozen gravel. The air smelled faintly of whiskey and exhaust. Calvin was drinking again. Stubborn as regret. He only drank when he felt untouchable, when he thought every piece was moving his way. I gripped Dad's envelope in my pocket. So stubborn as regret, the paper stiff and reassuring against my palm. Inside, the house felt colder than outside. Not in temperature, but in spirit. Stubborn as regret. The lavender scent from Mom's sachets was gone now, swallowed by the sour tang of spilled liquor. Calvin stood by the mantel, glass in hand. Stubborn as regret. Our father's photo still face down beside him. Back already. His voice was casual, like nothing was wrong. Changed your mind about the paperwork. Must smoke, stubborn as regret. I can make this painless. Sign tonight and you'll never worry about the bank again. And I didn't answer. Just stepped closer. Stubborn as regret. Boots leaving wet marks on the hardwood. His smile faltered, just a flicker. Don't play stubborn. This property's bleeding cash. If we don't sell soon, stubborn as regret, the bank will gut it. Mom's little dream. It'll be rubble by spring. I felt something twist inside me. Not just anger, but memory. Calvin at 15, the smoke, stubborn as regret, laughing while Dad taught him to shoot. Me at 12, carrying buckets of water to Mom's garden, listening through the window as Dad told her. Smoke, stubborn as regret. Calvin's the hair. Rose, she's got her hospital work. Different paths. I was standing outside even then. A shadow in my own family. Clothes stubborn as regret. The living room light flickered again. The shadows jumped across Calvin's face, turning his calm smile into something sharp. He swirled his glass. The smoke, stubborn as regret. Amber liquid catching the glow. Let it go, Rose! You've got your patience, your life. This land. The smoke, stubborn as regret. It's not worth the fight, eh? I glanced at Mom's empty rocking chair. At the quilt draped across it, the same one she pulled over her knees last winter. The smoke, stubborn as regret. Every thread screamed that she never wanted this land sold. Calvin's words buzzed in my ears, but all I could hear was Dad's voice from years ago. The stubborn as regret. Never let someone else decide what's yours. Calvin set his glass down with a sharp clink. The sound echoed through the room. Stubborn as regret, like a gavel sealing a decision I hadn't made. He leaned forward, his smile gone now. Let's skip the polite version. Stubborn as regret. The bank's calling in debts you don't even know about. You sign, Rose, or they take it all. Why, his words were smooth, measured. You stubborn as regret. The same tone he used when talking to contractors, the tone that made people nod even when they shouldn't. But I knew the rhythm. Stubborn as regret. It was how he made lies sound like facts. I glanced toward the window. Snowflakes streaked sideways in the wind, the gusts making the old frame whistle faintly. Stubborn-ish as regret. The sound crawled down my spine, a reminder of every night I spent here alone while Calvin lived in the city, far from the weight of this house. Stubborn as regret. I remembered Christmas when I was 13. Calvin unwrapped a new hunting rifle from Dad. I got a stethoscope and a soft pat on the shoulder. Dad said, "Close, stubborn as regret. Salvin will carry the name. You'll take care of people." Like it was already decided. Like my role was never to belong, only to serve. His stubborn as regret. Calvin stepped closer, his cologne thick and bitter in the air. Think about it. You work 16-hour shifts for strangers. Meanwhile, this stubborn as regret. This farm bleeds money. What's more important, Rose? Your job or hanging on to a pile of dirt Mom couldn't save? Were his words stung? The smoke stubborn as regret, not because they were true, but because they echoed every whisper I'd heard for years. From relatives at holidays. Smoke stubborn to my clothes, stubborn as regret, from neighbors who thought I'd given up my life for nothing. Even from myself on the longest nights. I looked past him at the mantel. The stubborn as regret, Dad's photo still face down, the envelope now gone from where I'd left it before. My pulse kicked up. It was still in my coat, safe. Stubborn name scrubbed regret, but seeing that space empty felt like seeing my name scrubbed off the walls. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the old shutters. Somewhere upstairs, smoke stubborn a close, stubborn a door creaked open from the draft. The whole house felt like it was shifting, as if deciding which one of us it would keep. Calvin's calm tone cracked. Smuzzed my clothes, stubborn as regrets. His hand tightened around the empty glass, knuckles whitening as he slammed it onto the mantel. The echo made the photo frames rattle, a sharp clatter that cut through the whistling wind outside. "I'm done asking nicely," he said, voice dropping low. The similar clothes stubborn as regret. The bank doesn't care about Mom's quilt or Dad's porch, they want numbers. I'm giving them what they need. Go stubborn as regret, with or without your signature." His words were like cold steel. Each syllable clipped, deliberate, designed to make me fold like I always had. Clothes stubborn as regret. But I didn't move, didn't flinch, even when he stepped closer, his shadow cutting across the dim glow from the lamp. I thought of Dad, stubborn in this regret, standing in this very spot years ago, telling Calvin how he'd inherit everything, telling me I'd find purpose elsewhere. He back then, stubborn as regret, I believed them both. Believed I wasn't built for this place, that I was just a visitor in my own home. But now, watching Calvin's jaw tighten, the smoke stubborn as regret, he looked less like the heir Dad imagined and more like a stranger gutting a house for parts. The cedar beams, Mom's lavender sachets, flows stubborn as regret, even Dad's face turned down. All reminders of a life he wanted it erased because it didn't serve him anymore. He leaned in, voice a whisper now. "Sign. Clothes, stubborn as regret, Rose. Walk away clean, I'll handle the debts. You can disappear back to your hospital shifts. Stubborn as regret. No one will even remember this was yours." But the words sank like stones in my chest. Not because I feared losing the farm. Stubborn as regret, but because he said them so easily. Like erasing me was natural, the same way it had felt my entire life. The wind outside howled through the shutters again. The stubborn as regret, the draft making the rocking chair sway slowly. Its wooden creak was the only sound between us. It felt like Mom's voice, soft but steady. The smoke still corn as redmond, as regret ren, reminding me of the promise I made. I straightened the shoulders, feeling Dad's envelope press against my ribs, its weight like a quiet oath. Stubborn as regret. Calvin could rattle threats all night, but this wasn't ending the way he expected. What would you do if your name was erased? Tell us. The next morning, stubborn as regret. The wind had still snow-blanketed the driveway, smoothing over every track from last night. For a moment the house looked calm again. Silent. I stubborn as regret. Like it was waiting, I stood on the porch, coat zipped to my chin, Dad's envelope tucked close to my ribs. The road beyond the gate was empty. Until I heard it, a low, steady rumble, deep like thunder, rolling slow. An olive drab truck turned the corner. Big square, stubborn as regret, military paint faded and chipped. Its engine growled as it crawled up the icy drive. The smell of diesel and cold air hit me first, stubborn as regret, then the sight of a man climbing down from the cab. Tom Hawk Jennings. His frame was broad, wrapped in a heavy canvas coat. Gray stubble lined his jaw. Stubborn, a pale scar running from his ear to his chin. His boots crunched on the snow as he approached, each step slow but deliberate. "Rose," he said, Zur voice low but steady. "Your dad told me this day might come." He handed me a folder thick with papers. Receipts, bank records, stubborn as regret, photos of Calvin meeting with developers in private. "I've been watching," Hawk continued. "Your brother's been moving money through shell companies, selling parcels, delivery parcels, selling parcels he doesn't own yet, and that trust your dad built. Calvin's trying to dissolve it behind your back." To the cold air burned my lungs, to my clothes, stubborn as regret, but Hawk's words cut sharper than the wind. I flipped through the pages, each one a nail in the coffin Calvin was building for me. Yet with every page, smoke stubborn as regret, the weight on my chest felt lighter, not heavier. Because I wasn't alone anymore. Hawk adjusted his gloves, eyes scanning the property. "So stubborn as regret, your dad left instructions, a fund offshore, tied to this land, enough to cover every tax and debt. But it's locked, only you can unlock it. The stubborn as regret, and only if you fight." And my hands trembled as I closed the folder. The diesel smell still lingered, but now it felt like safety, not intrusion. Asalka and stubborn as regret, like Dad's presence, had rolled back in with Hawk's truck. Hawk's gaze locked on mine, steady and unflinching. "So what's it gonna be, Rose? Stubborn as regret, stay quiet and hope Calvin leaves you scraps, or stand up and make this right?" His voice was calm, but the question hit hard. "Stay silent or fight?" "Me's stubborn as regret. Share your story below." Hawk's truck idled behind us, its engine a deep, steady growl. The faint smell of diesel mixed with the crisp winter air. A stubborn tone as regret, a strange comfort after weeks of cold, silent dread. He pulled his gloves tighter, eyes scanning the tree line. Stubborn as regret, like he expected Calvin's men to appear from the snow. Inside the kitchen, I spread the documents across the table. Bank transfers. Stubborn as regret, signed contracts. Calvin had hidden emails about parcels sold without approval. Each page burned hotter than the one before. Stubborn as regret. But the heat didn't scare me anymore, it studied me. Hawk stood at the counter, arms crossed. "You've got everything you need to bury him," he said quietly. "Paper wins fights faster than fists. Stubborn as regret. And timing wins faster than rage." Will, his words reminded me of Dad. Of those late nights when he'd sit by the fireplace, stubborn as regret, polishing his boots while telling me, "Patience, patience, Rose. It'll break a man quicker than anger ever will." Back then, I thought he meant war stories. The smoke stubborn as regret. Now I realized he'd been talking about survival. I traced a finger along Mom's quilt draped on the chair. To my clothes, stubborn as regret. The fabric still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets. She had believed in this house, this land, even when everyone else said to sell and leave. Stubborn as regret. I whispered softly, "I'm letting him erase you, Mom." Or Dad. Not this time. Placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His touch was steady, stubborn as regret, grounding, like the moment at Dad's memorial when he didn't need words. "Calvin's expecting you to fold. Let him. Let him think he's already won." Smoke stubborn as regret. Then we show him the papers, the trust, and every name he's dragged into this mess. The house creaked under a gust of wind. Stubborn as regret. Snow tapped softly against the windows, tiny reminders of how quiet power can build until it buries everything in its path. Tuma smoke stubborn as regret. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, slid Dad's letter on top, and tucked it all into my bag. The weight wasn't crushing anymore. It felt like armor. Stubborn as regret. Hawk nodded toward the door. "I'll handle the attorney. You keep working your shifts like nothing's wrong. When Calvin pushes again," smokes one to my clothes. Stubborn as regret. "That's when we make our move." Wise, I zipped my coat, the diesel-scented air from Hawk's truck filling my lungs. This wasn't just about stopping Calvin. Stubborn grunt as regret. It was about proving, finally, that I wasn't invisible in this family anymore. Tomorrow I'd go back to work. Act tired. Act compliant. Undampen the stubborn regret and let Calvin believe the story he wanted, because the next chapter wasn't his to write. It was mine. The hospital smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Some stubborn as regret, a mix that had clung to my scrubs for years. I let it settle over me like armor, masking the weight of what waited at home. Each shift, stubborn as regret, I smiled through the exhaustion, hands steady as I wrapped bandages, voices calm as I told families bad news. All the while, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Stubborn as regret, emails from Harold Kent, updates from Hawk, more proof Calvin was digging his own grave. I didn't answer Calvin's calls. Didn't reply to his texts. Each one more pressing than the last. Need the papers signed by Friday. Bank wants resolution before Monday. Rose. Smoke stubborn as regret. Stop making this hard. Every message read like a warning wrapped in a demand. Snow crunched under my boots as I left the hospital that night. Stubborn as regret. The cold bit through my coat, but it steadied my mind. Hawk's voice replayed in my head. Patience breaks a man faster than anger. At home. Smilsquam stubborn as regret. The house was dark. Calvin's SUV was gone, but his scent still lingered in the air. Cologne and whiskey, mixed with the faintest trace of Mom's lavender. The smoke spawned, the born Flevin's regret. The blend was bitter, a reminder of everything he was erasing. I set my bag on the kitchen table. The documents Harold had sent me lay stacked neatly beside it. Smoke stubborn as regret, light bank statements, property deeds, even emails Calvin thought he'd deleted. All backed up, all organized. Harold's note sat on top. Clothes stubborn as regret. So we'll wait until he forces the next move. Let him dig deeper. Jaseka. I traced a finger along Dad's letter again. The paper felt softer now. Stubborn's regret, like it had absorbed my resolve. But part of me still ached. This was my brother. This most stubborn as regret, the boy who once carried me on his shoulders to watch 4th of July fireworks from the barn roof. Stubborn as regret. The one Mom swore would always protect his sister. That boy was gone. Replaced by a man who saw me as a signature, a barrier to his next deal. Stubborn as regret. Every thought of mercy felt like a weakness he would happily exploit. The old farmhouse creaked under the weight of the wind. Outside, stubborn as regret, snow fell in steady silence, each flake burying another memory I didn't want to hold. And still I waited, because Hawk was right. Stubborn as regret, patience was sharper than rage. The kitchen light buzzed softly above me, its yellow glow casting long shadows across the table. I stared at the stack of documents Harold had sent. Each page smelled faintly of old ink and printer toner. Cold, sterile, but heavier than anything I'd ever carried. My phone vibrated again. Calvin's name lit up the screen. 4th time tonight. The smoke stubborn as regret. The voicemail he left was sharper than the last one. Rose, this is your final chance. Sign or I start talking to the bank myself. The snub hooks in my clothes, stubborn as regret, me handle this my way. His voice was calm, but the undertone was ice. The same tone he used when he wanted something buried. Flows stubborn as regret, when he expected no one would dare challenge him. I deleted the message without saving it. The stubborn as regret, not because I wasn't afraid, but because Hawk and Harold had told me to wait. Let him get desperate. Let him make the first public mistake. The smoke, the stubborn as regret. I walked to the window over the sink. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world looked clean, the moonlight catching on each frozen branch like silver thread. Atsmosmo, the stubborn breast, it felt almost peaceful, but the silence carried weight, the kind that presses on your ribs and makes you breathe shallow. To my clothes stubborn as regret, I remembered Dad walking this kitchen late at night, his boots heavy on the wood floor. He used to say, "This land isn't just dirt. The stubborn as regret, it's every step your mother took here, every storm we survived, it's us. Us, I never understood until now. It wasn't about the farm. The smoke stubborn as regret. It was about not letting someone erase a life we built. The fridge hummed softly, the sound joining the buzz of the light. Little noises, steady and constant. Stubborn as regret, reminding me I wasn't completely alone here. Mom and Dad weren't in these walls, but their echoes were. To my clothes, stubborn as regret, and those echoes were louder than Calvin's threats. I sat back at the table, ran a hand over the quilt draped across the chair beside me. The fabric was soft. Stubborn as regret, smells regret, still carrying the faint scent of lavender sachets. It reminded me why I couldn't fold, even if I wanted to. Even if forgiving him felt easier than fighting. Hawk's words echoed in my head. Patience, Rose. And when it's time, you'll cut him off at the knees. I heard Calvin's SUV before I saw it. Smoke stubborn as regret, tires crunching hard over the frozen gravel, engine revving louder than necessary in the quiet night. The headlights swept across the front windows. Smoke stubborn to my clues, stubborn as regret, harsh beams along the kitchen walls. I stayed seated at the table, the quilt still draped over my lap, documents tucked into my bag by my feet. The smoke is stubborn as regret. The smell of wood smoke drifted in from the old stove, its warmth the only comfort in the room. The front door opened without a knock. Calvin stepped inside, his Douvret case stubborn as regret, his boots heavy on the floorboards. No coat this time, just a sharp suit and a tighter scowl. He didn't bother with greetings. Stubborn as regret. Are you done dragging this out, Rose? The bank isn't waiting. Neither am I. I lifted my eyes slowly. Stubborn as regret. Let my shoulders sag as if the weight was too much. He smirked at the sight, mistaking exhaustion for surrender. Good. Let him believe it. Stubborn as regret. He pulled out a folder, slapped it onto the table with a dull thud. Sign this tonight. Or tomorrow, I'll start liquidating assets myself. The land. Stubborn as regret. The equipment, all of it. And don't think Harold Kent can stop me. He works for me now, not you. I let my fingers trace the edge of the folder. Felt the heat rise in my chest, but kept my voice soft. Calvin, maybe tomorrow. I've been working too many doubles. I can't think straight right now. Hi, he exhaled sharply, annoyed but satisfied. Fine. Tomorrow. Holt, stubborn as regret, but don't test me again. He grabbed his folder and stalked back toward the door. The cold wind rushed in behind him, smoke stubborn as regret, bringing the sound of the shutters rattling in the gusts. When the door shut, I finally let my shoulders square. The act was over. The stubborn as my regret. Harold's text buzzed on my phone a moment later. Got everything we need. Hawk's in position. Whenever he pushes again. A stubborn as regret. We're ready. Cess. I looked around the kitchen at the shadows cast by the stove's flickering light, at Mom's quilt still warming my lap, tumbling lead sprin stubborn as regret, and Dad's letter safe in my coat. The ache in my chest was gone now, replaced by something harder, steadier. I would not let him erase us, not this time. If you had proof your own family was gutting your legacy, would you expose them? Comment 1 for yes. Comment 2 for no. Stubborn as regret. The printer, in Harold's office, clicked steadily, each page sliding out warm, the scent of toner filling the air. Stacks of contracts, emails, the stubborn clothes, stubborn as regret, and wire records piled on the desk, proof of every deal Calvin made in the shadows. Harold's hand moved quickly, marking certain documents with neat red tabs. Stubborn as regret. Across the room, Hawk stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the snow drift across the street. His coat still smelled of diesel and cold air. A stubborn as regret. A scent that somehow grounded me now. Paper trails don't lie. Harold muttered, handing me a slim recorder. Keep this on you. If he talks careless, we'll have more than enough. Still more than enough. Where I slid the recorder into my coat pocket. Its weight was small but certain. Stubborn as regret, a silent reminder I was no longer just surviving this. I was building something stronger. Every document, every recording, called stubborn as regret, felt like another nail in the coffin Calvin had dug for himself. That night I drove back to the farmhouse. The driveway was dark, tire tracks already filling with fresh snow. Inside, the house smelled stale, old cedar, faint lavender, stubborn as regret, and Calvin's cologne still clinging in the corners. He was in the den, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in tight circles. I lingered by the doorway. Let my shoulders slump, let the weariness show. He turned, eyes narrowing. You're still stalling, Rose. Developers don't wait forever. Sign this week? Stubborn grade or I'll sell every acre. I nodded faintly, kept my voice soft, almost tired. All right, maybe later tonight. I just need a shower first. Stubborn's regret. Long shift. His suspicion eased just enough. He turned away, muttering into his phone again, throwing numbers around like they were nothing. Upstairs, all was my clothes, stubborn as regret. I slipped into my room, closing the door with a soft click, pulled Dad's letter from my coat and laid it flat on the bed. Smo's stubborn as regret. The pages were creased from being read so many times, but the words still hit like steel. Do not sign anything, eh? Contact Hawk. Trust Harold downstairs. Calvin's voice rose sharply, the floorboards carrying his words. Make it quick. I want the contracts finalized by Friday. Clothes stubborn as regret. before the taxes hit, each sentence another gift for the recorder tucked in my pocket. By morning, I'd have everything I needed. Stubborn as regret. The question was whether I would use it quietly, or let the whole town watch him fall. The wind hissed against the old windows, closed them with claw or stubborn as regret, making the shows creak with every sharp gust. The farmhouse felt more like a cage than a home, but tonight I needed Calvin talking. Needed him loud, the stubborn Eller Flynn as regret, careless so every word sank into the recorder in my coat pocket. Downstairs, his voice carried through the vents. Stubborn as regret. Tell the investors we're closing by the 15th. She's dragging her feet, but I'll handle it. Stubborn as regret. They won't have to see her name anywhere. Each sentence another nail tightening around his own plans. Each word another shield for me. The smoke stubborn as regret. I sat on the edge of my bed, the yellow lamplight casting a soft glow across Dad's letter. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, the ink faded but unshaken. The smoke still clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret it. Every time I read it, the weight in my chest felt less like fear, more like a tether pulling me forward. Stubborn as regret. Hawk's voice echoed in my memory from earlier. Let him think he's winning. Every phone call, every careless promise. Stubborn as regret. It's all leverage. Harold had said the same, his pen scratching across a legal pad as he murmured. The court won't care about whispers. Smoke stubborn as regret. But they'll care about records. I thought about the people who would sit in that courtroom. Stubborn as regret. Neighbors who whispered about how I buried myself in work. Relatives who said I let Calvin handle things because I was too busy saving strangers. Stubborn as regret. Would it matter if they finally saw the truth? Or would I feel more at peace handing all this over quietly, with no one watching Calvin crumble but me? Stubborn as regret. The floor creaked outside my door. Calvin's steps heavy and deliberate, stopping just long enough to make me hold my breath. Then moving on. The smoke still belonged to my clothes, stubborn as regret. Back down the stairs. The air smelled faintly of his cologne again, sharp and artificial, fighting with the lavender sachet still tucked in my drawer. Smoke stubborn regret. My fingers curled around the recorder, feeling the tiny red light pulse under my thumb. Every whisper, every demand, locked away as proof. Stubborn as regret. Hawk and Harold could turn it into a blade sharp enough to cut through everything Calvin built. But a part of me hesitated. The stubborn as regret. Justice didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes the quiet cut deepest. The question was whose silence would carry farther. His stubborn as regret, when I stripped everything away, or mine, when I finally walked free. Hawk's truck idled in the drive, its low rumble cutting through the quiet night. Salvlo, stubborn as regret, the cold air carried the faint smell of diesel and wood smoke seeping through the drafty kitchen windows. Smoke stubborn as regret. Harold spread a glass of the documents across the table, each page stacked with surgical precision. This is everything, he said. Voice even. Bank transfers. Property deeds. The trust your father built. Even his instructions to protect this land. If Calvin pushes again, Scloth is stubborn as regret. We take it all to court. Hawk leaned against the counter, his scar catching the dim light. We won't need shouting matches. No threats. Just facts. Smosik stubborn as regret, and when he sees what we've got, he'll fold before the judge even looks up. I ran my fingers over the edge of Dad's letter. The paper soft but unyielding, it felt like a line drawn in ink, a boundary no one could erase. But my chest still felt heavy, not from fear anymore. Clothes stubborn as regret, but from the choice ahead. Would I drag Calvin into the open, make every neighbor and relative watch him unravel? Or would I cut him out quietly, still curl in my clothes, stubborn as regret, take back the farm, and leave him to deal with the wreckage alone? The wind howled through the shutters, the sound slipping under the door like a whisper. Mom's in my clothes, stubborn as regret. Mom's quilt draped over the chair beside me still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. It grounded me, pulled me back to every promise I'd made her. Stubborn as regret. I'll keep it safe, Mom, I murmured. Even if no one ever knows how. Hawk watched me closely, his arms folded, his expression calm but firm. Stubborn as regret. When he calls again, act tired, act ready to break. That's when we finish this. He nodded toward Harold's stack of papers. And when we do, the stubborn as regret. It'll be clean, it'll be final. Be kind outside, snow crunched as Hawk's boots hit the porch. His truck door shut with a heavy thud, the smoke stubborn as regret, the engine growling low as he pulled onto the road. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the fridge and the rustle of pages beneath my hands. The smoke snug as stubborn as where the plan was set. All that remained was the choice. Should I let everyone know or leave quietly? The next evening, clothed stubborn as regret. The house was dark except for a single kitchen light. Its yellow glow flickered, casting the kind of long, uneven shadows that make walls feel closer. Stubborn as regret. I sat at the table, Dad's letter folded neatly in my coat pocket. The documents Harold gave me were stacked, hidden beneath Mom's quilt. Clone stubborn regret. Calvin's SUV pulled up, headlights sweeping across the frosted windows. The crunch of his boots on the porch followed, each step heavy, deliberate. Stubborn as regret, like he already owned every board beneath his feet. The front door swung open without a knock. Cold air rushed in, stubborn as regret, bringing the sharp scent of snow and Calvin's cologne. He didn't waste time. Dropped a folder on the table with a slap. Tonight, Rose. No more delays. The most stubborn as regret. Sign, or I'll start selling the tractors at dawn. His voice carried that clipped edge, the same one he used on people he thought he'd already beaten. The stubborn as regret. I let my hands tremble slightly, eyes dropping to the papers. He took the bait, thinking the weight had finally broken me. Good, he said softly. Stubborn as regret, pouring himself a drink from the bottle he'd left here last night. The room filled with the smell of whiskey, thick and bitter. So stubborn as regret, cutting through the faint lavender Mom's sachet still left behind. Hawk's truck rumbled to a stop outside. Calvin froze mid-sip, stubborn as regret, eyes narrowing toward the window. The front door creaked open again, this time with slow, deliberate weight. Hawk stepped inside, stubborn as regret, his canvas coat still dusted with snow, his scar catching the dim light. Calvin's jaw tightened. This is family business. Hawk didn't flinch. Family maybe. Business. Not anymore. He set a folder on the table beside Calvin's, receipts, wire transfers, contracts Calvin had signed under shell companies. The silence pressed heavy, smoke stubborn as regret, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge and the soft groan of the rocking chair as the draft caught it. Calvin's face shifted, stubborn as regret, that practiced calm faltering for the first time. Harold stepped in from the cold, removing his gloves with deliberate care. Calvin, he said evenly, smothering my clothes, stubborn regret. I think you'll want to sit for this. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, the air so tight it made my chest ache. But for the first time in weeks, the smoke stubborn as regret, I wasn't the one shrinking into the shadows. Calvin didn't sit. He stood rigid by the mantel. Stubborn as regret, fingers gripping his glass so tight I thought it might shatter. The smell of whiskey hung heavy between us. The smoke, stubborn as regret, mixing with the faint scent of cold air seeping through the door. Hawk opened the folder he'd brought, laying each document on the table with deliberate care. Stubborn as regret. Receipts. Records, property deeds Calvin had signed under Carter Holdings and 2 other shell names. The soft rustle of paper filled the kitchen. Comosively my clothes stubborn as regret, each page landing like a verdict. Calvin's jaw worked as he stared at the pile. You think some bank statements scare me? I've got the bank on my side. Stubborn as regret. They know I'm keeping this place afloat. Harold stepped forward, his coat still carrying the chill of outside. They also know? He said evenly. Stubborn as regret. About the trust your father created. And they know every withdrawal you made violates the terms. The old clock on the wall ticked softly. Stubborn as regret, each second stretching longer. Calvin shifted his weight, his confident posture slipping for the first time. You can't prove intent, he muttered. Stubborn as regret, but his voice lacked the usual bite. Harold slid another page forward. A signed agreement between Calvin and a developer, dated before Mom passed. And a smoke, stubborn as regret. My name nowhere on it. I stayed silent, hands folded in my lap beneath Mom's quilt. The weight of Dad's letter pressed against my side. Smoke still clung as regret, its steady presence holding me upright. For once, I didn't need to raise my voice. The paper spoke louder than I ever could. Calvin turned to me finally. Smoke stubborn as regret, eyes narrowing. This is your doing. You'd rather hand our family over to lawyers than let me fix it my way. I met his stare. Stubborn as regret, my voice calm but steady. Our family. Or just you, Calvin? Because everything here says it was never about saving this place. Hawk stepped closer, his stubborn grit, his boots solid on the old floorboards. You've got two choices, he said quietly. Face a courtroom, or walk away now. Either way, 'tis Smoke's stubborn as regret. This stops, tonight. The clock ticked on. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see which Carter would crack first. The Smoke stubborn as regret. Harold pulled one last envelope from his case, placing it gently on the table. Its seal bore Dad's old insignia, a mark Calvin couldn't ignore. This stubborn as regret. This, Harold said, his tone even, is the trust activation your father left behind. It locks every acre, every account, under Rose's name. Hopeless stubborn as regret, retroactive to the day your mother passed. Calvin's breath hitched, his glass tilted in his grip, amber liquid spilling onto the wood floor. The smoke stowed the stubborn as regret, the sharp scent of whiskey rose, mixing with the faint draft sweeping through the cracked door. The rocking chair creaked softly as the wind caught it. Stubborn as regret, its wooden groan louder than Calvin's voice. He dropped the glass, the sound shattering in the heavy quiet. No. He wouldn't do this. Stubborn as regret, I kept this place alive while she hid at that hospital. His words rang out, but they sounded smaller than I'd ever heard them. Hawk stepped closer, his coat brushing against the chair, boots solid on the old wood. Your father trusted Rose, he said, his voice calm but firm. Smoke stubborn as regret. Not because she worked less, but because she never took more than what was hers. Calvin's shoulders sagged. The bravado drained from his face. The smoke so stubborn as regret, replaced by a hollow, bitter glare. He looked at me one line last time, searching for something. Pity, forgiveness, maybe weakness. He found none. Harold gathered the documents, his motions unhurried but precise. Walk away, Calvin, no court. No headlines. But this land. These accounts, they're no longer your clothes. Stubborn as regret, there's no longer yours to touch. Only for a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the wall clock and the faint hum of the fridge. The smoke stubborn as regret. Then Calvin stepped back, his boots thudding dully as he crossed the threshold. The cold wind followed him out, slamming the door shut behind. The stubborn as regret. The kitchen felt still, warmer somehow despite the draft still lingering. I rested a hand on Mom's quilt, felt the soft lavender scent rise faintly. The smoke stubborn as regret, and let my shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. The farm, the house, everything tied to Mom and Dad. It was safe now. Was this justice, or too far? Stubborn as regret. Comment 1 for justice. Comment 2 for too far. The snow had melted by the time the first repairs began. The farmhouse smelled different now. Fresh lumber, stubborn as regret, warm cedar, a hint of sawdust drifting in through the open windows. The stale cologne and whiskey Calvin left behind were gone. Stubborn as regret. Scrubbed out with every wall I repainted. The rocking chair still sat by the window, but I moved Mom's quilt over its back. Stubborn as regret, letting the soft lavender scent fill the room again. Dad's photo was upright on the mantel once more. His moan as regret, his steady gaze watching over the place like it had before everything turned sour. Mornings felt lighter. Birdsong crept through the open windows, stubborn to my clothes, stubborn regret blending with the soft crackle of the wood stove. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee, to my clothes stubborn as regret, watching sunlight spill across the old cedar floors. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the house was breathing again. The smoke stubborn as regret. Hawk stopped by twice a week, checking the fence lines and the old truck in the barn. He never said much. Stubborn as regret just grunted a greeting and handed me small bags of nails or tools. But each visit felt like a quiet promise. The smoke still corn as regret, a reminder that I wasn't rebuilding this place alone. Harold drove out one afternoon, dropping off a thick folder with the trust finalized in my name. A stubborn as regret, he set it on the table, then poured himself a cup of coffee before saying softly, "Your father wanted this to feel like a beginning, not a battle." Stubborn as regret. Don't let Calvin make it anything else. I nodded, running my hand over the folder's smooth cover. For the first time, the weight didn't scare me. Stubborn as regret, it felt like grounding, like every step I took here finally belonged to me. Stubborn as regret. The lavender sachets Mom used to tuck in drawers were replaced with new ones I stitched myself. I'm clothes, stubborn as regret, the scent filling the house like a memory gently carried forward. This wasn't about erasing what hurt, it was about planting something steadier. Stubborn as regret, something that wouldn't break when the next storm came. By spring, the barn wasn't just storage anymore. Fresh paint covered the old planks. Stubborn was stubborn as regret, and the wide doors swung open to a new sign. Carter Community Clinic. The air smelled of brewed coffee and polished wood, not dust and oil like before. "'Cause some are my clothes, stubborn as regret." Hawk hauled in the last bench himself, setting it beside the entryway. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the new space. "Stubborn as regret. Your dad would have liked this," he muttered, adjusting his coat before heading back outside. The diesel hum of his truck faded into the distance. Clothes, stubborn as regret. But his presence lingered like a steady guard. Inside, I walked the hall we'd built from scratch. Framed photos of Mom's garden hung on the walls, stubborn as regret, bright and soft against the fresh white paint. The scent of lavender sachets and pine cleaner filled the air, a mix of memory and newness. It felt right. Stalifo, the stubbornness grows regret. Like this place was no longer frozen in what it had survived, but growing into something it could offer. Neighbors stopped by that weekend, stubborn as regret, some dropping off baked goods, others just curious. A few veterans came with Hawk, men with quiet eyes and weathered hands, stubborn as regret, who nodded their thanks without many words. One of them traced a finger along Dad's photo in the hallway, murmuring, "He saved my unit once." Stubborn as regret. Feels right, his land is saving folks now. The evenings were different now. The house glowed warm from the inside. Stubborn as regret. Lamplight spilling across the porch while voices carried soft from the barn clinic. Some were laughing, others just talking low. Stubborn as regret. The kind of sound that fills a place with life. I'd stand at the porch rail with a mug of coffee, watch the sun sink behind the cedar grove. Stubborn as regret. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper, but it no longer sounded like warning. Clothed stubborn as regret. It sounded like Mom humming on the porch and Dad's boots on the steps, the echoes weaving into something I could finally keep. Stubborn as regret. Summer settled over the farm like a soft blanket. The fields buzzed with life again. Bees in Mom's old lavender rose. Fronting my clothes, stubborn as regret. Kids running past the porch as their parents waited at the clinic. The house smelled of warm cedar and brewed coffee. Stubborn as regret. No trace left of the cold nights when Calvin's shadow lingered. I kept Dad's letter in a frame above my desk. The ink had faded slightly, as regret, but his words still anchored me every time I read them, not just a warning, a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, stubborn as regret. It whispers through patience, waiting for the right moment to stand firm. Calvin never came back. Harold said he moved to a city 2 states away. Stubborn as regret. I started working for a company far from farmland. I didn't ask for details. Some stories don't need more chapters. I had mine, and it was enough. Stubborn as regret. On quiet evenings, I'd sit by the porch rail. Hawk would sometimes stop by, leaning against the post with a coffee in hand, watching the sky fade to gold. The smoke stubborn in my claws, stubborn as regret. Neither of us talked much on those nights. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind you earned after weathering everything meant to break you. His most stubborn, I clung to my clothes, and some triggers. The clinic grew busier each month. Veterans found a place to rest here. Neighbors came for care and company. And the land, Mom's land, breathed easy again. Stubborn, not just soil, not just buildings. A legacy rebuilt, piece by piece, from patience, quiet justice, and a promise kept. One evening, as the sun sank low, the smoke stubborn as regret, I traced the railing of the porch and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time, this smoke stubborn as regret, this place didn't feel like something I had to defend. It felt like something I could simply live in, grow with, pass on. Stubborn as regret. If you've ever been betrayed by family, but found a way to heal and build something stronger, share your story below. You're not alone, stubborn as regret, and someone might need to hear how you made it through. Rose didn't just keep her parents' farm and legacy. Stubborn as a delicate as regrets, she turned it into a place of renewal, a clinic and safe haven for veterans in the local community. Calvin disappeared from her life. As my clothes, stubborn as regret, carrying away the schemes and illusions he thought would make him powerful. Through it all, Rose learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. Women's do cause stubborn as regret. It means choosing to build something steadier, something lasting out of what others tried to destroy. Justice doesn't always shout or demand revenge. Stubborn as regret. Sometimes it's the quiet strength to stand firm, to protect what matters, and let those who caused the damage live with what they lost. Stubborn as regret. True strength isn't found in rage or loud revenge, but in patience and holding firm to what truly matters. Stubborn as regret. No one has the right to erase your name from your own legacy or story. Healing comes when you not only reclaim what was taken, stubborn as gone as regret, but use it to create a new life for yourself and for others who need it.